Morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this. I am wanting to take a few minutes to walk you through the directions for the case study exam, trying to make sure that you are clear on how to be successful with this assignment. Okay, so first let me just describe, this is probably redundant. You have already, if you've already looked at the exam itself, it has several questions, but it also has a case study, which is a detailed description of a case situation. And in this case, for our class, it's always going to be a child or adolescent and a problem in which his or her family are experiencing. And there will often be a related mental health disorder. The characteristics of the child and family are provided, and some biopsychosocial history information is given relevant to the case, so that you can be able to identify the presenting problem and create a clinical formulation. Lastly, I want you to be thinking about how would you diagnose this child if, in fact, you were working with him or her, and how would you then create an approach that relies on an evidence-based strategy, or a treatment strategy that has good potential to be effective in this particular situation. I want to make sure that you understand. I'd appreciate it if you would respond to each of the questions that are asked in the case study in a paragraph form, so that you might have a paragraph on predisposing factors, precipitating factors, perpetuating factors. Then you might have a paragraph after you finish prognostic factors on the rationale for diagnosis. With the diagnosis, you may want to list the criteria that the child meets, but the most important thing is to make a case that, in fact, the child is a match for whatever diagnosis you select, or make a case for him or her not meeting the criteria. For each question, there's a series of points, and there's a rubric that I'll go over toward the end of the class. So for question 1 is worth 10 points. So it's out of the 20 points, it's half of the exam. Please see it as something to take your time with, think about, write carefully and thoughtfully about, and make sure that you have evidence to back up your assertions. So the question itself asks you to develop a biopsychosocial clinical formulation of the presenting issue. And I'm asking you to do that by identifying the predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, prognostic factors. And when you do each of those factors, as you did for the session 4 assignment, in class assignment, think about it as a biopsychosocial assessment, where you're looking at biological predisposing, psychological predisposing, and social predisposing. Now, there might not be in every case all 3 of those, but at least do your best to assess for them and identify them when they are present. You then might have a paragraph that really just looks at the protective factors historically in the child and family's life and in the current situation. Make sure that you do take that person and environment approach and look at individual, familial, and environmental levels. Now, you may not have a research study or a theoretical rationale for every single factor, but please cite research and theory to support at least some of your assertions. Make sure that you review the Mash and Barkley text on whatever clinical diagnosis you're considering. Make sure that you look at the chapter on a developmental systems framework to identify theoretical reasons for why, for example, poor attachment history might be a predisposing or precipitating or even perpetuating risk factor. Don't kill yourself with trying to figure out, is it predisposing or precipitating or perpetuating? Just throw it in one of those categories. I'm not going to, there's a lot of overlap, as we've already talked about in class, so that's not the key issue. The key issue is that you know what the risk factors are, and then you have a way to organize them. So just think about, if it seems predisposing, then it would have occurred during prenatal and prior to the child's history, or right immediately in terms of temperament or the child's postnatal period. Perpetuating tends to be, it wasn't, whatever the symptoms are, they weren't present before, but they are after whatever the perpetuating factor is. I'm sorry, that's precipitating factor. It can get confusing, so try to keep it straight, and I will too. Perpetuating is in the current situation, what is going to keep this child continuing to have these symptoms, or what are going to be barriers to recovery. And then prognostic are really about what is known about this disorder that makes it either more or less likely to have a negative outcome, and how does that match with the case study. Historical and current protective factors, same thing. Some research would be good, theory would be good, and again, I do suggest that you look at that chapter on developmental systems framework. I believe it is chapter 1 or 2 of the Mash and Barkley text, but it goes into those theories that we covered the first class. And of course, the research is cited, secondary research is cited throughout the Mash and Barkley text. You also have some research that is primary source in some of your Blackboard readings. Use it. Make sure that you have some citations. Don't just make assertion by argument. So here's how I want you to do the clinical formulation. I want you to combine what Dawkins talked about as the biopsychosocial formulation that most of you are familiar with. And when you wrote your in-class assignments for session 2, a lot of people said they do biopsychosocial, and they're very comfortable with them. And that's great. So draw on your knowledge. You're always looking for all 3 sources of influences. But I want you to combine that with the time axis formulation that Dawkins talks about. So you're going to use these 4 P's, these 4 ways to organize the influencing factors. And so do what you did for the in-class assignment. For predisposing, consider what are the biological, psychological, and social predisposing, what are the biopsychosocial precipitating, and so on. So you're really combining the biopsychosocial with the time axis formulation. And if you still have doubts or don't feel comfortable with either of those, don't hesitate to call me, email me. I would be delighted to work with you on this. Okay, so this is just kind of summarizing what Dawkins says about what each of these factors are, and if it's still not clear to you, go back to the Dawkins reading. So that's question 1. Question 2, and again, read the question carefully, check your work carefully, make sure you do everything in the question, because the rubric is based on your answering everything thoroughly. Identify the disorder or disorders that you would be most concerned about, given what you know about Terrence in this case, and then be very specific about how you would come up with the diagnosis, or reject the diagnosis, or rule out a diagnosis. So you need to review the criteria for any disorder that you're considering. And for each of the criteria that you think the child meets, you need to identify that criterion and then match the behavior or mood or emotion or interaction that you see the child engaging in that is evidence that that child meets that criterion. Don't just say he's got 5 symptoms of inattention. Give me each of the symptoms of inattention, and if he only had 5, he wouldn't meet the criteria, right, for ADHD, predominantly inattention. But if he had 6, he would, but you still need to identify, okay, doesn't pay attention to small details. Mother reports his homework was often had careless mistakes. So you want to have the criterion and then evidence of it. Finally, make sure that you meet the general or universal criterion for saying that this is a disorder by making sure that the child has met the criteria for sufficient duration to match the DSM criteria, and talk about the severity. Often you have to specify whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. So in order to really do that, you have to review the DSM-5 criteria. In almost all cases, the criteria are listed in the Mash and Barkley text, and or you can also go to the DSM manual, which is online. There's an e-version of it in TU Library that will allow you to go through all the criteria as well. Okay. Then for question 3, here's where you need to think about your intervention approach. And you want to identify an intervention strategy that has good potential to be effective in this particular case, with this particular child and family, with your particular abilities. And so, of course, you're going to take an evidence-based approach. You need to have some research that backs up your selection of this approach, and you need to also identify your rationale in terms of the evidence-based approach, which I'm going to skip here to what do we say is an evidence-based approach. We talked about, I presented that in, I believe, session 2 as well. You've got to match the child's problem with the appropriate intervention, and that's that triangle where you're going to use an approach that has empirical evidence for effectiveness or efficacy, meaning it's been shown to be effective with presenting issues similar to the one your child client has. 2, you have the training and expertise to use it, or here's the other thing. If you of course, you may not feel comfortable using this approach. So you could say, you would use supervision and read and develop the model, develop your understanding of the model. So don't say, I can't use anything because I've never practiced CBT yet, or I've never practiced social learning theory. Say that you will develop your expertise and training in that area, and make sure that you have clinical supervision as you're using this approach. Okay, so think about how you would prepare to have expertise in this approach. And then finally, do consider the client's presentation. Individually, what does this client seem open to? Developmentally, where is he or she in their capacities and their preferences? And are there any cultural issues to consider when you match the approach to the child? Finally, you may use a model that you can't implement fully, but you're going to take pieces of that model and implement it in the way that matches your training and expertise and matches the client's cultural, developmental, and individual preferences. I use the example of a behavioral approach that is technically supposed to rely on daily charting of the child's behavior. Taking that technique, matching it to the family's ability and time for charting, I asked the family to only chart 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day, still using the empirical evidence that charting works, but having to adapt it to match my client's preference. Okay, so the grading of the case study is according to this rubric. There is a blank version of the rubric in the assignment folder. Let me go over it briefly with you now. So each question is worth a specified number of points, and I'm looking specifically for you to do each of these things. So make sure that you don't miss one of these, because you'll just automatically miss a point. Even if you don't get it exactly right, you will be addressing what needs to be addressed if you consider it. So you've got to identify what are the presenting issues, what are the primary presenting problems that you'd be concerned about. Then you're going to walk me through a biopsychosocial time axis clinical formulation, writing a paragraph on predisposing factors, considering biological, psychological, and social factors, and so on for each of the factors according to the time axis. Throughout this isn't a separate section, the last thing, research support for factors identified. Throughout each paragraph where you're identifying the factors, you should be citing research and or theory that provides a good rationale for why this is a known risk factor. So cite studies and or theories about social learning, attachment history, any of those theories that we went over in the first class and that are in, again, I think it's the second chapter, maybe it's the first chapter of the Barkley and Mash text. For question 2, that's worth 5 points or a third of the exam, and you're going to, I'm sorry, a quarter of the exam. So you're going to tell me what you think you'd be concerned about in terms of disorders. Where is this falling? Is this a disruptive behavior disorder? Is this a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder? Are there co-occurring disorders? Is it a mixture of 2 or more disorders that you're considering? And then identify specific criteria that each or the one disorder that you believe is met are met. Identify the criteria and then match it with the specific behaviors or emotions that are presented by that child or family. Then finally, in question 3, I want you to take an evidence-based approach. Again, this is going to be fairly brief and certainly a concise summary. You won't have a lot of space or weight to go into a lot of detail, but certainly you need to have a strategy that you think has best potential for being effective in this case, with a theoretical and or empirical rationale. The research or a specific theory suggests that this is a very good match for this presenting problem, for this child, and for your you as a clinician. And that section is worth 5 points. Okay, let me be clear about citations. I would like you to use APA. This is not a manuscript, so don't give me a cover page and running head and all that stuff. This is an essay exam. All I want is a page that says essay 1, question 1, and you know what? If you the answer to question 1, double spaced. Don't worry about all the other headings and cover pages. The 2 things that I'm concerned about with APA is that you use appropriate parenthetical citations and that you have a references page that follows APA. So you're going to, let's go down to the paragraph. So this is an example of how you might write about a specific risk factor. Okay, so this, you can read 2, but let me just walk you through it. So Joshua seems to meet the criteria for what Hammond, Rudolph, and Abiad 2014 identify as the prototypical form of depression. Now, 2 things, and this is an idiosyncrasy. It's not all that important, but it drives me crazy. If you're citing in text where it's part of the sentence, you use and. You spell out the word and. If you're citing in, if you're citing in a parentheses, you use the ampersand, that symbol for and. So if this had said, according to Kruger and Jones, it would have been Kruger and then the ampersand Jones, because this is just one citation, one author. You don't have that. Okay, so here you want to cite using and if it's in the text, and then put the year in parentheses. A risk factor for Joshua is his negativity. Adults with depressive symptoms were likely to report high negative emotionality during adolescence, according to Kruger, 1999. Now, you did not read Kruger in the original. You read about the Kruger study. So you have to cite Kruger, 1999, as cited in Hammond et al. Now, I can use et al. Now because it's more than two. Anytime you have more than two authors, you go to et al. But you have to always identify all authors at least once, and then once you identify all authors, you can use et al. Remember, et is not a abbreviated word. It is the Latin word for and that's the full word. Al is an abbreviated word. That's where you put the period. Okay, I know a lot of this is very mundane and picky, but these are things that when you write grants or other papers, it shows that you are very thorough and careful, and that you understand how to write research. So if you can do this, it also helps me, because then I don't get irritated. I'm in a better mood when I'm reading your paper. So I don't expect you to do it absolutely without flaw. I'm just looking for your effort here. So that's one thing, is how do you cite in text. And frankly, I made a mistake here. It should say, this should be a beginning parenthesis before the word as. Before the word 1999. So it should say, according to Kruger, no comma, and then in parentheses it should say 1999 as cited in Hammond. A lot of times you might just say, likely to report high negative emotionality during adolescence, and you skip the according to, and then you just put in parentheses Kruger 1999 as cited in Hammond et al. 2014. Okay, I'm belaboring this a little bit. Don't get too lost in the forest here. I'm more worried about the content. I'm not as worried about APA. I'm just suggesting that you try to follow this format for APA. Don't kill yourself to make every single thing flawless, like I said, but do make an effort to try to follow at least the major format with parenthetical citation, and also with your references at the end. Now, here's a thing that everybody seems to miss. Barkley and Mash is an edited version. So every time you read a chapter, it's by a different author than Barkley and Mash. And I noticed in your homework assignment or your in-class assignments, you guys are, not all of you, but I've noticed most of us are just going to cite Barkley and Mash. But that's incorrect. I'm not going to take off for it for the in-class assignment, but I do want you to do this for the exam. So you have to look and see who was the exact author of the the chapter that you cited from, and you cite those authors, and the year is always the same year as the book was published in 2014. Then you give the name of the chapter, and you and then this is how you cite an edited book in APA. You say in, then you go to the two editors, and you put their initials first and their last names. You put in parentheses editors, you put in parentheses the year, and then you put in parentheses the chapter and the page numbers of that chapter. Finally, now we're going to cite the book, and this is italicized, and then the place of publication and the publishing company. So use this as your model. Don't worry about memorizing this. You have the PowerPoint as well as this video to draw from. Okay, again, I don't want you to look at this as like APA is all that important for doing well in this class. It's important to cite and reference as close to properly as you can. Obviously, the content of your work is the most important, your ability to work with children and families, and what you know about it as illustrated in your paragraphs, in your answers to the questions is most important. But if you could do your best to follow APA format, I'd really appreciate it. That's it, guys. Please email, text, call me anytime with questions or concerns. I hope that you will find this an interesting exam to complete. Don't forget to read for session 5, and I'll see you live next. Bye.